When the copper heiress died on May 24, 2011, at age 104, the most valuable thing she owned was not the three Manhattan apartments overlooking Central Park, the Connecticut chateau she never visited, or the $300 million in banks and bonds. It was a 23-acre estate on a Santa Barbara bluff that she had not seen in 58 years, but had preserved with religious devotion at $40,000 per month. Bellosguardo, beautiful lookout in Italian, sits at 1407 East Cabrillo Boulevard, commanding views of the Pacific that seem to stretch beyond the edge of the world. The staff had orders to keep everything in first-class condition and make no changes. They followed those orders. The automobiles in the carriage house, a 1933 Chrysler convertible and a 1933 Cadillac limousine, sat with 1949 California license plates for more than 60 years. The furniture was covered. The gardens were immaculate. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. For 58 years, the Clark family spent roughly $28 million maintaining a house they would never see again. First Anna, then Huguette, who lived the last 20 years of her life in a hospital room measuring 8 feet by 12 feet. This is the story of Bellosguardo, a mansion preserved not by use but by abandonment. An heiress who spent the last 20 years of her life in a hospital while owning some of America's grandest homes, and a fortune built on copper that ended up funding one woman's retreat from the world her father had conquered. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by stories of America's forgotten estates and the people who built them, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories take extensive research to uncover, and your support helps us keep bringing them to you. The story begins not in California but in Montana, where Huguette's father was building one of the greatest and most ruthless fortunes in American history. Chapter 1. The Copper King. By 1907, when William Andrews Clark finished his single term as United States Senator from Montana, he had achieved everything a man born in a Pennsylvania log cabin might dream of. He commanded a fortune that rivaled Rockefeller's, conservatively estimated at $200 million, equivalent to roughly $31 billion today. He had founded the city of Las Vegas. He owned railroads and newspapers and controlled the copper that carried electricity into the modern world. He was also, according to Mark Twain in a scathing essay published that year, as rotten a human being as can be found anywhere under the flag, and the most disgusting creature that the Republic has produced since Tweed's time. Twain's assessment was not hyperbole. Clark had bribed his way into the Senate with more than $300,000 distributed among Montana legislators, roughly $5.5 million in modern terms, budgeted as carefully as his mining operations. When the Senate refused to seat him and launched an investigation, he resigned on May 15, 1900, before they could expel him. Then he ran again and won legitimately, serving from 1901 to 1907 without distinction. The scandal contributed to the passage of the 17th Amendment, which mandated direct election of senators. When asked about the bribes, Clark reportedly said, quote 22, "He was born on January 8, 1839, in a log cabin in Connellsville, Pennsylvania. The detail matters because Clark never forgot it and never let anyone else forget it either. In 1856, his family moved to Iowa, where young William taught school and studied law at Iowa Wesleyan College. He might have become a lawyer or a teacher. Instead, in 1863, he joined the Montana Gold Rush. His placer mining claim paid modestly, enough to convince him that the real money was not in mining, but in supplying miners. He drove mules between Salt Lake City and the Montana boomtowns, hauling eggs and tobacco. He sold eggs at $3 per dozen when they cost 25 cents. The markup was not theft. It was simply business in a place where supply met desperation. From trading, he moved to banking in Deer Lodge. When miners defaulted on loans, he repossessed their claims. Within a decade, he owned enough small mines to justify learning metallurgy. He enrolled in a crash course in New York City, returned to Montana, and began buying up what others considered played-out silver mines in Butte. They were not played out. They were sitting on copper. By the 1880s, Butte was producing more copper than anywhere else on Earth. and Clark was one of three men who controlled it. The others were Marcus Daly and F. Augustus Heinze, the Copper Kings, as newspapers called them. They fought each other with newspapers they purchased specifically for that purpose, with political machines they built from bribes and favors, and with genuine business acumen when bribery proved insufficient. Clark built smelters and electric power companies. He owned banks and streetcar lines. He controlled the infrastructure of entire cities. In 1902, he partnered with railroad tycoon E. H. Harriman to build the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad. The line needed a water stop between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. Clark subdivided 110 acres he owned in Nevada, creating a maintenance station he called Las Vegas. On February 5, 1908, Nevada created Clark County, naming it in his honor. The county now contains more than 2 million people. Clark sold lots on Fremont Street for as much as $1,750. He could not have imagined the city it would become. He saw only a water stop that happened to make money. His mansion in Butte contained 34 rooms decorated by Tiffany with every modern convenience the 1880s could provide. He built Columbia Gardens for the children of Butte, flower gardens, a dance pavilion, an amusement park, a lake, and picnic areas, not from generosity, but from the calculation that content workers made fewer demands. Later, he would build a 100 to 21-room mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City, spending what contemporaries estimated at $7 million on construction and furnishings. He filled it with art he purchased on annual trips to Europe, paintings by Degas and Renoir, tapestries and sculptures, objects chosen with genuine taste and displayed with genuine pride. The Senate seat mattered to him more than any of it. He wanted respectability. He wanted to be called senator. He ran 4 times between 1888 and 1900, spending increasingly vast sums, making increasingly brazen bribes, until finally he won in December of 1899. The victory lasted 5 months. The U.S. Senate investigation revealed such dazzling corruption that even colleagues accustomed to Gilded Age excess were embarrassed. $1,000 bills were passed in envelopes. A state legislator's debt to a bank disappeared when Clark bought the bank. Another legislator received $30,000 and was seen celebrating publicly. The evidence was overwhelming. Clark resigned on May 15, 1900, walked out of the Senate, and immediately began planning his next campaign. When he won again in 1901, he was 72 years old. He served one term marked primarily by his protection of mining interests and advocacy for irrigation projects that would benefit his land holdings. Twain's essay appeared in 1907 as Clark's term ended. The two men had attended a dinner together at the Union League Club. Twain was a close friend of Henry H. Rogers, vice president of Standard Oil and president of Amalgamated Copper, Clark's business rival. The essay may have been as much about copper politics as moral judgment, but the words were accurate enough. Clark was, by any measure, magnificently corrupt. His first wife, Catherine Louise Stauffer, died of typhoid in 1893 after bearing him 7 children, at least 3 of whom died young. Within a few years, he had taken a second wife 39 years his junior, a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, a former ward who had been living in his household since her father died penniless. But that is another story. By 1923, Clark was 84 years old. He had conquered Montana and Arizona, built Las Vegas, served in the Senate, filled museums with his art collection. His fortune was among the largest in America. He owned a mansion in Butte and another on Fifth Avenue. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve and accumulated wealth beyond any reasonable need. That year he paid $300,000 cash, equivalent to roughly $5.4 million today, for a property in Santa Barbara. It was a summer house, nothing more. An Italian villa on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, damaged by an earthquake, but salvageable. He would own it for 2 years before dying of pneumonia at his Fifth Avenue mansion on March 2, 1925. He had no way of knowing that the Santa Barbara property would define his family's legacy more than the Senate seat or the copper mines or the founding of Las Vegas. He had no way of knowing that the house would survive untouched for nearly a century, while everything else he built crumbled or was forgotten. The copper mines would close. The Fifth Avenue mansion would be demolished. The Butte mansion would become a bed and breakfast. But Bellosguardo would endure, preserved by his daughter in a way he never could have imagined or understood. The property sat 2,000 miles from his copper mines, overlooking the Pacific on the emerging paradise of the Santa Barbara coast. But before that 1923 purchase could matter, there was the matter of his second family and the tragedies that would shape everything that followed. Chapter 2. The Second Wife. In 1893, Catherine Louise Stauffer Clark died of typhoid at age 49, leaving William Andrews Clark a 54-year-old widower with 7 children from his first marriage, at least 3 of whom had not survived to adulthood. Within a few years, he had taken a new wife who was 39 years younger than himself, a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. Even in an age accustomed to Gilded Age excess, the relationship scandalized. Anna Eugenia LaChapelle was born on March 10, 1878, in Michigan, to French-Canadian immigrants. Her father settled in Butte, became one of the early pioneers, and died penniless. After his death, Anna, her mother, and her siblings became Clark's wards. Contemporary newspapers would emphasize this detail repeatedly, that Anna had been living in Clark's household, dependent on his support since she was 15 years old. Clark sent her to Paris to study harp. She had aspirations as a singer. She was beautiful, described in one account as having 1 brown eye and 1 blue eye, a detail that may have been romantic invention, but was repeated often enough to become part of the story. They claim to have married secretly in 1901 in France, when William was 62 and Anna was 23. No proof of this marriage was ever produced. The union remained secret until 1904, when the Butte newspapers announced it on their front pages. The scandal was not merely the age gap, though that was extraordinary enough. The scandal was that she had been his ward, living under his protection, educated at his expense, shaped by his household since adolescence. The newspapers did not use the word grooming because the word did not exist in that context in 1904, but the implication hung in the air nonetheless. William's quote about Anna survives in the records. She, quote, 4. Whether this was his observation or his instruction is unclear. What is clear is that Anna preferred privacy to spectacle, French to English when she wanted secrecy, and the company of her daughters to the demands of society. They had 2 daughters. Louise Amelia Andre Clark was born on August 13, 1902, in Spain. The Clarks were traveling in Europe, as they often did. Huguette Marcel Clark was born on June 9, 1906, in Paris, while William was serving in the United States Senate and battling Theodore Roosevelt over mining regulations. Huguette's birth took place 3,000 miles from Montana, in a city where Anna could speak French freely and where no one particularly cared that her husband was a corrupt senator from a territory most Parisians could not locate on a map. They returned to New York when William's term ended. The family settled into the 121-room mansion on Fifth Avenue, a palace for 4 people after 1907, 5 including staff who lived elsewhere in the building's 15 floors of space. Andre was quiet and withdrawn. She had lived in Paris until she was 5 and never quite adjusted to New York. She joined the Girl Scouts and found friends there. In 1911, newspapers across America carried a photo of her at age 9, arm in arm with her niece Catherine Morris, of the same age, who was holding hands with Huguette, nearly 5. They were standing on the deck of the RMS Adriatic, crossing the Atlantic to attend the coronation of King George V. The girls were accustomed to luxury liners, the Cunard and White Star lines, the best staterooms, the assumption that the ocean was something you crossed when you felt like it. In the summer of 1919, Anna and the girls went to their house in Rangeley, Maine, for what should have been an unremarkable vacation. William stayed in Montana, attending to business in Butte. Andre was 16 years old, 1 week away from her 17th birthday. She fell ill on the trip with what appeared at first to be a simple fever. The fever worsened. A severe headache developed. They were 2 days' travel from New York, far from the quarantine suite in the tower at 962 Fifth Avenue, where the family doctor could attend to them properly. Anna sent for Dr. William Gordon Lyle, the family physician, who rushed up from New York, to assist the local doctor. For 4 days, Andre lay ill with Anna and Huguette by her side. The diagnosis came, probably tubercular meningitis, a devastating inflammation of the membranes covering the brain and spinal cord. Penicillin would not be reported as effective against meningitis for another 20 years. Andre died on August 6th or 7th, the records conflict, 1919. William received a telegram in Butte. He traveled as fast as trains would carry him, but he arrived after her death. She was 16 years old, 1 week before her 17th birthday. Huguette was 13. The family did what wealthy families do when grief exceeds their capacity to process it. They built memorials. In 1920, William and Anna donated 135 acres in Briarcliff Manor, New York, for the first National Girl Scout camp. They named it Camp Andre Clark. Andre had loved the Girl Scouts. Her diary, which her parents read after her death, revealed how much the troop had meant to her. The friends, the activities, the sense of belonging she had struggled to find in New York society. In 1928, Huguette donated $50,000, equivalent to roughly $916,000 today, to the city of Santa Barbara to excavate a salt pond and create an artificial freshwater lake. She stipulated that it be named the Andre Clark Bird Refuge. The refuge contains 42 acres with a 29-acre lake, sitting directly across East Cabrillo Boulevard from what would become the family's estate. Huguette would donate more funds in 1930 to complete the work, which was designed by the locally renowned landscape architect Ralph Stevens. In 1989, 70 years after Andre's death and 36 years after Huguette last visited Santa Barbara, she would send another $30,000 for cleanup and educational programs at the refuge. On the Bellosguardo property, there was a rustic thatched roof cottage that had been called Geraldine's Cottage, named for the daughter of the previous owners. The Clarks renamed it Andre's Cottage. It stands there still. Anna's personality shifted after Andre's death, or perhaps it simply became more pronounced. She had never cared for social distinction, William's phrase, but Anna's behavior confirmed it. After 1919, she and Huguette withdrew further into themselves. They spoke French to each other for privacy. They traveled together constantly, Europe, California, Montana. They lived, as one later account put it, only for each other. The grief had contracted the family like a damaged organism, protecting its vital organs. William lived until 1925, dying of pneumonia on March 2nd at age 86 in the Manhattan palace he had built. He left his fortune divided among his 5 surviving children from his first marriage and his widow and daughter from his second. Anna was 47 years old. She had lived for nearly a quarter-century in William's shadow, in homes he had chosen, surrounded by his art collection and his ambitions. She had raised 2 daughters and buried 1. She had married a man nearly twice her age who had been responsible for her welfare since she was 15. She had 1 daughter left, enormous wealth, and for the first time in her adult life, complete freedom to make her own decisions. The question was not whether she would abandon the damaged California estate William had purchased 2 years before his death. The question was what she would build in its place. Chapter 3. The Italian Villa. The property that William Andrews Clark purchased in 1923 sat on a bluff at the eastern edge of Santa Barbara, commanding views that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the visible world. On clear days, the Channel Islands floated on the Pacific horizon. The California mountains rose behind the young city like sentinels. Below, East Beach curved away in both directions, the shoreline meeting the ocean in a line so perfect it seemed drawn by intention rather than geology. The Italians have a word for such a prospect, Bellosguardo, beautiful lookout. The name came from the family who built the original house. William Miller Graham and his family constructed an Italian villa there in 1904, hiring architect Francis Wilson to design a structure appropriate to the setting. The result was a mansion in the Italianate style with a 26-foot veranda and a 58-foot entrance hall paneled in white marble and oak. The Grahams were social people. They threw famous parties. A psychic one night dancers and jugglers another, once a trained monkey for the entertainment of guests who had already seen everything else California society could offer. The Graham's daughter Geraldine had a cottage on the property, a small structure where she could escape when the parties grew tiresome. The grounds stretched across more than 23 acres with 1,000 feet of ocean frontage, enough space that different members of the family could claim different territories and maintain the illusion of privacy, even while living together. Eleanor Graham sold the property to William Clark in 1923 for $300,000, roughly $5.4 million in today's terms, paid entirely in cash. The price was substantial, but not extraordinary for Clark, whose fortune was measured in hundreds of millions. He was 84 years old at the time of purchase. His health was declining. He had 2 years left to live, though he could not have known that. The Clark family, William, Anna, and Huguette, spent summers at Bellosguardo in 1923 and 1924. André was already gone, dead 5 years by the time the purchase was made. Her absence shaped everything about how the family used the house. They came not to entertain or display their wealth, but to be alone together in a place where no one knew them well enough to ask uncomfortable questions about the missing daughter. In 1925, the Santa Barbara earthquake struck. The records conflict on the exact timing, whether the earthquake occurred before or after William's death on March 2nd of that year. What is certain is that the Italian villa was significantly damaged. The structure remained standing but was no longer safely habitable. Walls cracked, the foundation shifted, the 26-foot veranda listed at an angle that made it unusable. William died of pneumonia at his mansion at 962 Fifth Avenue in New York City. He was 86 years old. His estate, conservatively valued at $200 million to $300 million, was divided among his 5 surviving children from his first marriage and his widow Anna and daughter Huguette from his second. The Fifth Avenue mansion would be sold in 1927 against the family's wishes as part of the estate settlement. The Butte mansion would eventually become a bed and breakfast. The San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad would be absorbed into larger systems. The copper mines would close. Las Vegas would grow beyond anything Clark could have imagined, but his name would fade from the city's memory, preserved only in the county name that few residents could explain. Anna and Huguette inherited Bellosguardo, along with their share of the estate. They also inherited a decision. The damaged Italian villa could be repaired, sold, or demolished. Most widows in Anna's position would have sold immediately. The house was 2,000 miles from New York. It was damaged. It required staff and maintenance and attention that a widow with a teenage daughter might reasonably choose to avoid. Anna did not sell. She kept the property. She kept the staff. She paid for maintenance on a structure she had no immediate plans to use. For 8 years, from 1925 to 1933, Bellosguardo sat partially empty, tended by caretakers who maintained gardens and grounds for owners who visited rarely, if at all. During those years, Huguette would marry at the property in a private ceremony in 1928, using the damaged Graham house for the last time before it was demolished. What Anna was considering during those 8 years becomes clear only in retrospect. She was not simply maintaining a damaged property. She was imagining what she might build in its place, something that would be hers, not William's, designed according to her tastes rather than his, a building that would speak French where California spoke Spanish. Before retreating entirely from the world, Anna Clark had one final grand gesture to make. In 1933, as the Great Depression tightened its grip on America, as 25% of the workforce stood unemployed, she decided to tear down the Italian villa and build a French palace in its place. Chapter 4. The Daughter Huguette. Marcelle Clark was everything American society expected of a copper heiress by the mid-1920s. She had made her debut at the Ritz-Carlton. Her social outings appeared regularly in the society pages of the New York Times. She was called the Baby Copper Queen, one of America's most eligible young women. She was also profoundly uncomfortable with all of it. She was born on June 9, 1906 in Paris, while her father was serving in the United States Senate and battling Theodore Roosevelt over mining regulations. William was 67 years old when Huguette was born. Anna was 28. They were living in Paris because Anna preferred it and because Paris did not care about Montana politics. The birth took place 3,000 miles from the copper mines that funded it, in a city where the family could move without newspaper reporters tracking their movements and recording their scandals. Huguette's childhood unfolded across multiple continents. The family maintained their sprawling Fifth Avenue residence, traveled frequently to Europe on luxury liners, spent time in Montana at properties owned by William's son from his first marriage, and after 1923 began summering in Santa Barbara. She was educated at the Spence School for Girls in Manhattan, supplemented by private tutoring in music, languages, and etiquette. She studied violin and eventually owned at least 3 Stradivarius instruments. She studied painting and took classes at the Art Students League of New York under the instructor Tadej Stajka. She learned to speak French fluently, a skill that would later serve as a privacy shield when she wanted to speak with her mother without being understood by staff or visitors. The defining event of her childhood occurred when she was 13 years old. On August 6th or 7th, 1919, her sister Andrée died of meningitis 1 week before her 17th birthday. Huguette was at André's bedside in Rangeley, Maine, watching her sister deteriorate over 4 days from a fever to death. The trauma shaped everything that followed. She learned, as one later account would put it, to be self-sufficient and keep herself company. She made a list of happy moments that emphasized travel away from New York. The train rides, the boat trips, the sense of motion away from the city where André was no longer alive. In 1925, when Huguette was 18, her father died. His death freed the family from the last remaining obligations to Montana, or to the social expectations that came with being a senator's wife and daughter. Anna and Huguette could have gone anywhere, done anything. They chose increasing isolation. Huguette's society debut in 1926, 1 year after William's death, was expected by everyone except possibly Huguette herself. She appeared at balls and dinners. She attended events with friends from the Spence School. The New York Times documented her movements in the society pages with the assumption that this was a young woman preparing for marriage and the continuation of the Clark dynasty. She was 20 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and trapped in a performance she had no interest in continuing. In December 1927, her engagement to William MacDonald Gower was announced. Gower was a Princeton University graduate, the son of William B. Gower, one of William Clark's top accountants and business associates. The match was appropriate by every measure that mattered to society. He came from the right kind of family, had the right education, and understood the expectations that came with marrying a copper heiress. The wedding took place on August 18, 1928, at Bellosguardo, in a private ceremony held in the damaged Graham House before it was demolished. The same year, Huguette donated $50,000 to create the André Clark Bird Refuge across the street from the estate. The marriage lasted less than 1 year. They separated in 1929. The divorce was finalized in Reno, Nevada on August 11, 1930. The exact reasons remain unclear because Huguette never spoke about them publicly, but accounts suggest Gower was more interested in her bank account than her person, that he bragged about marrying into wealth, that he was never good enough for her in ways that the family could see, even if society could not. At age 24, Huguette returned to live with her mother at 907 Fifth Avenue. She would never remarry. She would never have children. She expanded her apartment from the 12th floor to encompass a floor and a half, eventually combining 3 separate apartments into 42 rooms, totaling 15,000 square feet. It was a palace for 2 people who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Her artistic pursuits intensified after the divorce. She painted models in elaborate dress, self-portraits, still lifes, and New York cityscapes. 40 to 50 works in total that would eventually hang in her studio at Bellosguardo. She collected dolls, beginning with French pieces she had acquired as a child at age 5 and expanding to include elaborate Japanese dolls, commissioned specifically for her collection. She played violin and piano and harp. She read extensively from the library she shared with her mother. She did everything that wealth allowed, except engage with the world outside her apartment. Society expected her to remarry, to produce an heir, to continue the Clark name, to do something with her fortune besides maintain it. She refused all of these expectations silently by simply not participating. She stopped attending society events. She stopped appearing in the New York Times society pages. By her 30s, she had effectively withdrawn from public life and society, which had once been so interested in the baby copper queen, eventually stopped asking where she had gone. She and Anna lived together in the Fifth Avenue apartments, speaking French to each other for privacy, managing their properties remotely, traveling occasionally but less frequently as Anna aged. They had tried society. They had tried California summers. They had tried maintaining the life that William had built for them. By 1930, they were finished trying. What they wanted was not more houses or more money or more social connections. What they wanted was to be left alone with their memories of André and their art and their books and their dolls. But before they could retreat entirely, Anna had one final project. She was going to build something that was entirely her own. Chapter 5. Anna's Palace. In 1933, as the Great Depression reached its nadir and 25% of the American workforce stood unemployed, as breadlines stretched around city blocks and families lost their homes to foreclosure, Anna Clark made a decision. She would demolish the earthquake-damaged Italian villa in Santa Barbara and build a French chateau in its place. The project would cost, though the exact figure has been lost to history, hundreds of thousands of Depression-era dollars. It would provide employment for dozens of workers when work was scarce, and it would create one of the finest examples of French Beaux-Arts architecture on the California coast. Anna was 55 years old in 1933, finally free to build something, according to her own vision rather than William's. The 121-room Fifth Avenue mansion had been sold in 1927 against the family's wishes as part of the estate settlement. The Butte mansion had always been William's domain, but Bellosguardo was hers. She could tear down the Graham house and start fresh, creating a building that reflected her years in Paris, her French-speaking household, her preference for privacy over display. She hired Reginald Davis Johnson, a Pasadena-based architect born in 1882 who had designed some of Santa Barbara's most prominent buildings. Johnson had completed the Santa Barbara Biltmore in 1927, just down the coast from Bellosguardo, in the Spanish colonial revival style that dominated California architecture at the time. He had also designed the Santa Barbara Post Office, which would be completed in 1937 and would go on to design Cates School, Lotus Land, and the Music Academy of the West. He had family connections to the Clarks. He had designed a villa for the widow of Walter Clark, Huguette's cousin who had perished on the Titanic. Johnson's background included training under Robert Farquhar, who had worked for Carrere and Hastings on the Frick Mansion and the New York Public Library before coming west. Farquhar had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where he had introduced football to France, an odd footnote that mattered because it connected him to the French architectural tradition that Anna wanted for her California house. Johnson understood both California and Paris. He could build Anna a house that belonged to neither place entirely, but drew from both. The design Anna and Johnson developed was deliberate in its defiance of local fashion. Santa Barbara in the 1930s was committed to Spanish colonial revival architecture: red tile roofs, white stucco walls, arched doorways, courtyards with fountains. The Biltmore, which Johnson himself had designed just down the coast, exemplified the style. Anna wanted French. She wanted the 18th century French Riviera, formal and symmetrical, with none of the theatrical flourishes that characterized Spanish colonial. She wanted a building that looked inward to reflecting pools, rather than outward to ocean views, that valued restraint over spectacle, that spoke the language she and Huguette spoke to each other in private. Construction began in 1933 with the demolition of the Graham house. The structure came down carefully, piece by piece over several weeks. Some materials were salvaged. The carriage house from the Graham era was retained and still stands today. But the main house disappeared, replaced by a construction site that would employ craftsmen and laborers for the next 3 to 4 years. The new building was designed as a U-shaped structure with solid concrete construction, walls, floors, and ceilings poured as a single mass, and then finished with fine woods. The exterior was clad in 3 inches of Indiana limestone over the concrete, creating a facade that read as gray stone but was actually faced onto something far more permanent. The rigorously symmetrical gray stone building that emerged was variously reported as 21,666 square feet or 23,000 square feet, depending on which records you consult. The discrepancy has never been resolved, but the house contains 27 rooms, regardless of which measurement is accurate. The layout included 6 family suites with bedrooms, 3 small bedrooms for servants, a music room designed to accommodate 2 grand pianos and multiple harps, a library for the extensive book collection, and an artist's studio specifically for Huguette's painting. There was a formal reception room with wood paneling and a painted muslin ceiling, materials that had been transferred from the demolished Fifth Avenue mansion, and before that had come from European castles. There was a dining room with antique chairs, a bureau room for Anna's office with intricate French-inspired carved pastoral scenes, and a circular ladies' powder room. The interiors featured elaborate crystal chandeliers, ornately painted ceilings, intricately carved wood throughout, and detailed cornices that demonstrated the level of craftsmanship Anna was willing to pay for. The house had one architectural oddity that would puzzle visitors decades later, a door that opened to nowhere, leading not to another room or hallway, but simply to a wall. Whether this was a mistake or an intentional statement about the nature of the house, a building designed for privacy and isolation, is unknown. The grounds were designed with equal care. The motor court in front featured a floral design created with Mexican pebbles laid in intricate patterns. Behind the house, a reflecting pool was installed, flanked by 80-year-old olive trees that had been on the property for decades and would survive for another 80 years beyond the completion of the house. Anna designed a circular rose garden. There were formal lawns, carefully maintained paths, and views that extended across the 23 acres to the ocean beyond. Construction was completed in 1936 or 1937. Sources vary on the exact date, suggesting that the work continued over an extended period and that the house was gradually finished rather than completed all at once. The exact cost has been lost to history, a surprising omission given the Clark family's meticulous record-keeping. Perhaps Anna paid cash and kept no receipts. Perhaps the records were destroyed. What remains is the building itself. Anna had spent the Depression building a French palace on a California bluff. She had given work to craftsmen and gardeners and masons when work was scarce. She had created rooms for Huguette's painting and music, a library for their shared love of books, and gardens that rivaled any European estate. The house stood ready, perfect and complete, every door and window and chandelier placed exactly where Anna wanted it. The question was not whether it was beautiful. It was undeniably beautiful. The question was how these 2 intensely private women would use their beautiful lookout, and whether building it had been enough or whether they would actually need to live in it. Chapter 6. The Golden Years. A typical summer at Bellosguardo in the late 1930s began with Anna and Huguette Clark arriving by train from New York City. The journey took 3 to 4 days across the continent in private railway cars. The staff would have spent weeks preparing the mansion, opening windows that had been shuttered for months, refreshing cut flowers in crystal vases, ensuring that everything from the reflecting pool to the automobiles in the carriage house met exacting standards. The 2 women arrived not to display their wealth to Santa Barbara society, but to escape. John Douglas managed the estate, a position he would hold for more than 30 years, eventually lasting through the entire period of abandonment until his termination in 2018. Under his supervision, a full staff maintained the property. Gardeners who tended the rose garden and olive trees, household staff who cleaned and prepared meals, maintenance workers who ensured that the concrete and limestone and woodwork remained in perfect condition. The staff size during peak operations was estimated at 50 people, a small army dedicated to maintaining a house for 2 residents. Daily life at Bellosguardo centered on art and music. Huguette painted in her studio, creating the 40 to 50 works that would eventually hang on the walls for visitors to see 70 years later. She painted models in elaborate dress, self-portraits that revealed her artistic skill without revealing much about her psychology, still lifes, and some New York cityscapes. The music room contained 2 Steinway grand pianos and at least 2 of Anna's French pedal harps. The sound of Chopin and Debussy filled the house when Huguette practiced. The library held bound volumes of Dante, Homer, Virgil, Maupassant, Dickens, Voltaire, Faust, Milton, and Conrad. Books that were dusted regularly and turned periodically, even when no one was reading them. Anna and Huguette lived together as they always had, speaking French to each other for privacy, conducting their lives according to rhythms that made sense only to them. They were, as one account described it, devoted to each other, living only for each other. The isolation that had begun after André's death and intensified after William's death continued at Bellosguardo, but here it felt less like withdrawal and more like intentional living. They had built this house. They could live in it however they chose. In the early years, from 1937 through the early 1940s, they did some entertaining. They welcomed friends and guests. They participated, to a limited degree, in Santa Barbara social life. There was one notable friendship between Huguette and Barbara Dorn, the daughter of the caretaker, an unusual cross-class connection that suggests Huguette's social awkwardness was not snobbery but genuine discomfort with the performances that society demanded. The 1943 photograph of Huguette in a Japanese print dress is one of the last known photographs of her. She was 37 years old, standing in the California sunlight, dressed in the style of a culture she admired from a distance. Her doll collection by this time included extensive Japanese pieces in addition to the French dolls she had been collecting since age 5. After World War II, the FBI interrogated her about her suspicious interest in Japanese culture. An investigation that revealed more about American paranoia than about Huguette's actual activities, but that increased her already substantial desire to avoid attention. The automobiles in the carriage house, a 1933 Chrysler Royal 8 convertible and a 1933 Cadillac V16 7-passenger limousine with a golden goddess hood ornament, received their last license plate renewal in 1949. After that date, the cars simply sat in the garage, covered in cloth, preserved as they were. Whether this was because Anna and Huguette stopped driving or because they stopped planning to drive is unclear. What is clear is that after 1949, the pretense of maintaining the cars for use was abandoned. They became part of the house's preservation, objects frozen in time like everything else. Across East Cabrillo Boulevard from Bellosguardo sat the Huguette Clark Bird Refuge, created with Huguette's $50,000 donation in 1928 and her additional funds in 1930. The 42-acre refuge with its 29-acre lake remained a physical reminder of the sister who had died 30 years before. In 1989, decades after abandoning the property, Huguette would send another $30,000 for cleanup and educational programs at the refuge, demonstrating that even in isolation, she maintained some connection to the community through André's memorial. Staff instructions during this period were clear: maintain everything perfectly and change nothing. The mandate applied to the house, the gardens, the cars, even the doghouse, which continued to be kept in perfect condition after the dog died. The staff followed orders. They maintained a house for two women who visited less and less frequently as the 1940s progressed into the 1950s. Anna was aging. By 1953, she was 75 years old. The train journey from New York, 3 to 4 days across the continent, switching trains, managing luggage and staff, had become too difficult. In 1953, she was too frail to make the trip. Huguette stayed east with her mother. Neither woman ever returned to Bellosguardo. The exact date of their final visit is not precisely recorded, though staff and documents suggest it was around 1953 or in the early 1950s. What is certain is that Anna's health was declining, and the logistics of traveling had become insurmountable. The beautiful lookout would sit empty for the next 58 years. The automobiles remained in the carriage house with their 1949 license plates. The furniture was eventually covered. The paintings hung in the studio. The pianos fell silent. The olive trees continued to grow, tended by gardeners who maintained a property for owners who would never return. John Douglas and his staff continued their work, waiting for ladies who had made it clear through their absence that waiting was all that would be required. Chapter 7. The Inheritance. On October 11, 1963, Anna Eugenia LaChapelle Clark died at her apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue at age 85. The obituaries noted primarily her husband's accomplishments, the copper fortune, the Senate scandal, the railroads. Anna herself was described simply as the widow of Senator William A. Clark, mother of two daughters, one deceased. The newspapers did not mention that her death would send her surviving daughter into isolation so complete that the world would lose track of Huguette Clark for the next 48 years. Huguette was 57 years old when her mother died. She had lived with Anna for 33 years since her divorce in 1930, speaking French together, managing their properties remotely, maintaining their careful distance from a world that demanded more than they were willing to give. Anna was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx in the family mausoleum with William and Andre. The family finally reunited in death, if not in life. Huguette inherited Bellosguardo completely. Full ownership of 23 acres on a California bluff, a 21,666 square foot mansion, the automobiles with their 1949 plates, the paintings and furniture and gardens that had been maintained perfectly since 1953 despite no one living there. She also inherited the question of what to do with it. She gave John Douglas two instructions: keep everything in first-class condition and make no changes. The monthly maintenance cost was $40,000, equivalent to roughly $480,000 annually in modern terms. She paid this cost every month for the next 48 years until her own death in 2011. Combined with the decade Anna had paid after their final visit, the total expenditure was approximately $28 million to maintain a house they would never see again. When asked years later through intermediaries why she did not visit, she said Bellosguardo held too many reminders of her absent mother, that it was too sad to visit. But she never considered selling. She never stopped paying for perfect preservation. The logic made sense only to Huguette. Too sad to see, too precious to sell, too painful to visit, too important to neglect. The staff continued their work under Douglas's management. Full crews maintained the gardens, the rose garden blooming in cycles that only the gardeners witnessed, the reflecting pool cleaned and filled and maintained despite no one sitting beside it. The olive trees pruned and tended as they grew older and more valuable. The house was kept in perfect condition. Furniture was eventually covered to protect it from decades of dust. Rugs were wrapped. Nothing was moved. The doghouse was maintained perfectly, even after the dog died. The automobiles were covered in cloth and left exactly where they sat. Photos were taken regularly and sent to Huguette in New York to confirm that everything remained as she had ordered it. In New York, Huguette's isolation intensified after her mother's death. She lived in the 42 rooms she had created by combining 3 apartments at 907 Fifth Avenue, 15,000 square feet that had once housed 2 women and now contained only 1. The late 1960s marked the last time she was seen in public, though the exact date is not recorded. Eventually, her isolation became so complete that even the servants who came to clean never saw her. She stayed in a separate apartment when they were present, communicating only through notes and phone calls. Her activities centered on television, which became an obsession. She watched Dick Cavett, The Forsyte Saga, The Flintstones, Rocky and Bullwinkle, and Smurfs, hours of programming that filled days that might otherwise have been unbearable in their emptiness. She sent 37 boxes of videotapes to her ex-husband William Gower in France, maintaining some connection to her past, even as she severed connections to her present. She collected dolls with increasing intensity, commissioning custom pieces, building a collection that would eventually be valued at $1.7 million. She painted. She presumably played music, though no one heard her. She conducted her life through phone calls and correspondence, managing 3 properties she never visited from an apartment she never left. In 1952, she had purchased Le Beau Chateau in New Canaan, Connecticut, 52 acres with a 14,266 square foot house. She never visited it even once after the purchase. The pattern was clear. She acquired properties and then maintained them in perfect condition without ever using them. Whether this was madness or devotion, waste or preservation, pathology or simply the behavior of someone with unlimited wealth and unlimited grief is impossible to say with certainty. Her generosity continued throughout this period, despite her isolation. She gave gifts to staff members, artisans who worked on her properties, employees, children. She had what Bill Dedman, who would later write her biography, described as a fairy tale checkbook, one that was refilled whenever it ran out of magic beans. Money was never a constraint. The $300 million fortune that she would leave at her death was accumulating steadily through investments she never saw, in accounts she managed remotely, funding a life of perfect isolation. Bellosguardo during this period was photographed regularly, documented meticulously, maintained as if the owners might return tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. The house sat empty from 1953 to 2011, 58 years without a single overnight guest, without a meal cooked in the kitchen, without music in the music room, without paintings created in the studio. Time was frozen. The 1949 license plates remained on the cars. The furniture aged under its coverings. The olive trees grew larger. Everything else stayed exactly the same. By 1991, Huguette was 84 years old, increasingly frail, and suffering from untreated medical conditions that were disfiguring her face. The system she had constructed to keep the world away was about to fail her. To get medical treatment, she would have to leave her apartment for the first time in decades, exposing herself to the very attention she had spent 48 years avoiding. Chapter 8. The Hospital Years. Huguette Clark entered Doctors Hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan on March 26, 1991, with facial lesions from basal cell cancer that had gone untreated for years. The cancer had disfigured her face so severely she could barely see or eat. Her personal physician later said she looked like an apparition, like somebody out of a concentration camp. She arrived by private ambulance on a stretcher to avoid being seen. The doctors successfully removed the cancer. They told her the treatment was complete. They strongly urged her to go home. She refused. For the next 20 years, 7,364 nights, this woman who owned palatial homes in Manhattan, Connecticut, and California lived voluntarily in hospital rooms no larger than 8 feet by 12 feet, surrounded by dolls and Smurf cartoons, directing a preservation empire she would never see again. Doctors Hospital was an elite Upper East Side facility that had treated F. Scott Fitzgerald, Spencer Tracy, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Marilyn Monroe. In 1994, it was purchased by Beth Israel and renamed Beth Israel North, later Beth Israel Medical Center. The hospital recognized Huguette's wealth immediately. The development office flagged her as a significant potential donor and began tracking her net worth. The systematic exploitation had begun before her cancer treatment was even complete. She chose to stay. The choice was not medically necessary. The cancer had been removed successfully, but the hospital room, measuring 96 square feet, offered something her 42-room apartment did not: complete control over her environment. She decided who entered. She decided when they entered. She decided what they could expect from her. The room cost $1,200 per day, paid from her own funds without insurance. The annual cost was $438,000. Over 20 years, she would spend more than $8.7 million on room fees alone. The hospital allowed her to use aliases. She became Harriet Chase primarily, with fake room numbers provided to anyone who called. The privacy measures were elaborate and carefully maintained. Her primary caretaker was Hadassah Perry, a Filipino private duty registered nurse who worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week for many years before reducing to 8-hour days. Perry was paid $131,000 annually. The night nurse was Geraldine Coffey. The personal assistant was Chris Sattler. Together, they formed the small universe of people who saw Huguette regularly during her 2 decades of voluntary hospitalization. Her daily life centered on dolls which surrounded her bed and television, particularly Smurf cartoons, which played constantly. She made telephone calls to attorneys and accountants. She conducted correspondence. She reviewed photographs of Bellosguardo that were sent to her regularly, providing instructions to John Douglas and the staff on maintenance issues that needed attention. She continued to manage all 3 of her properties remotely: the Fifth Avenue apartments, the Connecticut chateau she had never visited, and the California estate she had not seen since 1953. In 2006, a neurologist visited to evaluate her mental state. His assessment was documented. Cute as pie, perfectly content. He found no cognitive decline, no dementia, no evidence that she was anything other than an elderly woman who had made unusual choices about where to live. Medical records confirm her alertness and capacity throughout her hospital stay. She was eccentric, she was isolated, she was not incompetent. Her gift-giving during this period was extraordinary even by the standards of her earlier generosity. She gave Hadassah Perry $31 million in total while she lived. Checks for $5 million handed over multiple times. Real estate purchased for Perry's family. Gifts to Perry's children. She gave her goddaughter $10 million. She gave TV repair workers $25,000 for what must have been remarkable television repair work. She gave Dr. Henry Singman $100,000. She continued paying $40,000 per month for Bellosguardo's maintenance, adding another $9.6 million to the cost of preserving a house she would never see. The hospital's pressure for donations was relentless. In 2004, they asked her to buy the entire hospital for $125 million. She declined. But she did give them a Manet painting, made donations totaling millions over the years, and eventually left them $1 million in her will. Email records later revealed during the estate battle would show the hospital's hunger for money, the development office's constant calculations about how much more they might extract from the reclusive heiress in room whatever fake number they were using that week. During her hospital stay, a Degas painting, Dancer Making Points, was stolen from her Fifth Avenue apartment. The theft was discovered eventually, but not immediately, and the painting was never recovered. The robbery increased her paranoia about going home, reinforced her belief that the hospital was safer than the apartment, confirmed her father's warning from decades earlier. No one will really love you. You have to be careful. The theories for why she stayed multiplied as the years accumulated. Perhaps the disfigurement from cancer treatment made her unwilling to be seen. Perhaps she was paranoid about relatives wanting her money, a paranoia that would prove justified when 19 of them contested her will after her death. Perhaps the Degas theft convinced her that her apartment was not secure. Perhaps her bond with nurse Hadassah Perry, who saw her every day for 20 years, was stronger than any connection waiting for her in the outside world. Perhaps she simply preferred the controlled environment of 96 square feet to the overwhelming space of 42 rooms. Perhaps all of these explanations were true. Perhaps none of them captured the full complexity of a woman who had spent 84 years learning that isolation was safer than connection. She told the nurses stories about her youth, surfing with Olympic swimmer Duke Kahanamoku, taking an unauthorized plane ride over Central Park in 1919, courtesy of her nanny's pilot boyfriend, traveling across Europe with her mother and Andre before everything went wrong. She was animated when discussing the past, reclusive about the present, and entirely uninterested in the future except insofar as it related to maintaining the properties she would never see. In her final month, she was moved to intensive care. On May 24, 2011, 2 weeks before what would have been her 105th birthday, Huguette Marcel Clark died of natural causes. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in the family mausoleum with William, Anna, and Andre. She left behind a $300 million fortune, 3 untouched estates, a $1.7 million doll collection, and 2 wills signed 6 weeks apart that would trigger one of the most contentious probate battles in recent American history. Chapter 9. The Battle for Bellosguardo. In the hours after Huguette Clark's death on May 24, 2011, her attorney Wallace Bach and accountant Irving Kamsler appeared to possess an ironclad position. As executors of her April 2005 will, they controlled a $300 million estate. The will directed that Bellosguardo become the centerpiece of an arts foundation, leaving nothing to Huguette's distant relatives. Within weeks, 19 of those relatives filed papers in New York Surrogate's Court claiming fraud, mental incompetence, and undue influence. The fight would involve 60 attorneys working in 3 countries, 54 depositions, running $25 million in legal fees, and determine whether the mansion Huguette had preserved for 58 years would survive another generation. The case centered on two wills signed 6 weeks apart in 2005, when Huguette was 98 years old and living in the hospital. The first will, executed in March, left $5 million to her nurse, Hadassah Perry, and the remainder to 19 distant relatives, descendants of William Clark's children from his first marriage. The second will, signed in April, cut out the relatives entirely. It increased the nurse's bequest to $30 million, gave $500,000 each to attorney Bach and accountant Kamsler, named those two men as executors and trustees, created the Bellosguardo Foundation for the Arts, left $1 million to Beth Israel Hospital, and gave a Monet Water Lilies painting to the Corcoran Gallery. The red flags were numerous and obvious. The attorney had drafted a will naming himself as a $500,000 beneficiary and as executor, positions that would generate significant ongoing fees. The accountant was similarly situated. The nurse stood to receive $30 million, increase from $5 million just 6 weeks earlier. What had happened in those 6 weeks? The relatives who challenged the will argued that nothing legitimate had happened, only manipulation, isolation, and exploitation of a mentally incompetent woman who spent her days watching Smurfs and surrounded by dolls. Additional concerns emerged during discovery. Irving Kamsler was a registered sex offender who had pleaded guilty to disseminating indecent material to minors. The hospital had been pressuring Huguette for donations for years, including asking her to buy the entire facility for $125 million in 2004. Hadassah Perry had received $31 million in gifts while Huguette lived, on top of her annual salary of $131,000. The attorney and accountant had no documentation proving that Huguette understood they were included as beneficiaries in the will they had drafted. The 19 relatives who challenged the will had last seen Huguette in 1957, 54 years before her death. Most had never met her at all. They were great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of William Clark's children from his first marriage, connected to Huguette by blood but not by relationship. Their attorney was John R. Morkin of the law firm Farrell Fritz. They claimed that Huguette's lifestyle, the dolls, the Smurfs, the 20 years in a hospital room choosing isolation over mansions, demonstrated mental incompetence. They claimed that the nurse, attorney, and accountant had isolated her from family, controlled her communications, and manipulated her into signing a will that benefited them at the expense of her actual relatives. The executors responded with medical records. A neurologist who examined Huguette in 2006 found her mentally sharp, perfectly content, with no cognitive decline or dementia. Hospital records documented her alertness and capacity throughout her stay. She was eccentric, yes. She made unusual choices. Certainly, but eccentricity is not incompetence. She had agency. She made her own decisions. The fact that those decisions seemed strange to people who did not know her did not make them invalid. The Manhattan District Attorney opened a criminal investigation in 2010, focusing on Bach and Kamsler. The investigation would close in June 2015 without filing charges. But the questions it raised about undue influence and lack of documentation haunted the civil case. During the summer of 2012, attorneys conducted 54 depositions in 3 countries. Wallace Bach testified for 6 days. Irving Kamsler testified for 5 days. Hadassah Perry testified for 4 days. Chris Sattler, the personal assistant, testified for 2 days. The goddaughter testified for 1 day. The video depositions revealed a complex picture of Huguette's final decades, a woman who was generous to the point of seeming irrational, who formed intense bonds with her caregivers, who managed her properties meticulously while refusing to visit them, who was simultaneously competent and profoundly isolated. The New York Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, became a party to the litigation because the will created a charity. His office investigated whether improper influence had occurred and eventually played a key role in brokering the settlement. The trial was scheduled to begin on September 17, 2013. Jury selection began. 60-plus attorneys prepared for a 6 to 8 week trial that would cost millions more in legal fees and expose every detail of Huguette's life to public scrutiny. On September 24, 2013, in the middle of jury selection, a settlement was signed and delivered to Judge Nora S. Anderson. The deal had been negotiated literally overnight. Attorneys working through the darkness to avoid a trial that would benefit no one except the lawyers billing hourly. The settlement terms reflected a compromise that gave something to everyone except clarity about what had actually happened. The 19 relatives received $34.5 million collectively, paid tax-free by the estate. Their legal fees of $11.5 million were also paid by the estate. They received an additional $2.5 million, half of the $5 million that the nurse agreed to pay back. They retained the right to sue the hospital for additional damages. Hadassah Perry received nothing from the will, giving up the $30 million bequest. She agreed to return $5 million of the $31 million in gifts she had received while Huguette lived, keeping $26 million. Her attorney's fees of $1.5 million were paid by the estate. Through her attorney, she issued a statement saying the Perry family was happy to contribute to the settlement to help Madame Clark retain whatever privacy she had left, and that they were blessed to have met her. Wallace Bach and Irving Kamsler forfeited their $500,000 bequests. They lost their positions as executors and trustees. They were released from malpractice claims. Bach's insurance carrier paid $1 million to the settlement. The law firm that had defended the will, Holland and Knight, received $11.5 million in legal fees. The Bellosguardo Foundation received the property, valued conservatively at $85 to $100 million. It received the $1.7 million doll collection, most of which would be auctioned in January 2020 for nearly $2 million with select dolls retained. It received $4.5 million in cash. The foundation was structured as a New York entity, not California as Huguette had envisioned, with the board formed by the Attorney General's office. One board seat went to a Clark relative, Ian Devine. Seats were reserved for the Santa Barbara community and a representative from the former Corcoran Gallery. The California attorney James Hurley, who had represented Huguette's Santa Barbara interests, also received a board seat. Beth Israel Medical Center kept its $1 million bequest, but remained subject to potential lawsuits seeking to recover more. The hospital's documented pressure campaign and hunger for donations during Huguette's 20-year stay suggested that additional recovery might be justified. But that battle would be fought later, if at all. Judge Anderson called the settlement a fair result. The relatives who had never met Huguette received $48.5 million total when legal fees were included. The nurse, who had cared for her every day for 20 years, received nothing from the will and paid back $5 million, but kept $26 million in gifts. The attorney and accountant who had drafted the will naming themselves lost everything they had been promised. And Bellosguardo, the beautiful lookout that Huguette had preserved at a cost of approximately $28 million over 58 years, would finally open to the public, but only after another 5 years of delays, negotiations, and bureaucratic processing that no one anticipated when the settlement was signed. Chapter 10. Opening the Doors. The settlement had been signed on September 24, 2013. Judge Anderson had called it a fair result. The Bellosguardo Foundation had been approved. The public had been promised access. And then nothing happened. For 5 years, Santa Barbara residents watched the gates remain closed, the gardens maintained by unseen staff, the windows dark behind the olive trees that were now more than 160 years old. The beautiful lookout that had been preserved in isolation for 58 years would require 7 more before it could fulfill its new purpose. The delays had multiple causes, all predictable and all frustrating. The IRS needed to negotiate the gift tax debt. Huguette had died owing $82 million in gift taxes from her lavish generosity during life, with penalties accumulating at $9,000 per day. The estate and the foundation needed favorable terms, or the entire settlement would collapse under tax obligations. The negotiations took years. Property title needed to transfer from a New York estate to a New York Foundation for California Real Estate, a process that involved multiple jurisdictions and legal systems. The foundation board needed to be formed by the Attorney General's office. Disputes over the foundation's structure and mission needed to be resolved. In December 2018, 7 years after Huguette's death and 5 years after the settlement, the property was finally transferred to the Bellosguardo Foundation. The transfer triggered another controversy. John Douglas, who had served as estate manager for more than 30 years, was terminated along with the full staff who had maintained the property through decades of abandonment. In November 2018, Douglas wrote a letter pleading for intervention, warning that the property risked having not a blade of grass unattended if the institutional knowledge of the longtime staff was lost. The foundation was accused of mismanagement, favoritism in new hiring, and neglect of the very property it had been created to preserve. The IRS settlement eventually came through on favorable terms, approved by the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. The foundation's total assets exceeded $95 million once the tax issues were resolved, better than anyone had projected during the 2013 settlement negotiations. The property alone was worth $85 to $100 million conservatively. The doll collection would sell for nearly $2 million. The cash settlement provided operating funds. The foundation had the resources it needed if it could overcome the bureaucratic obstacles between a closed estate and an open museum. The board formed gradually. Ian Devine, Huguette's great-grandnephew, took the Clark family seat. Sandy Nicholson, who had been involved since the foundation's inception, represented Santa Barbara community interests. Dick Wolf served as board chairman for event planning. Josh Conviser joined the board. James Hurley, Huguette's California attorney, provided continuity from the settlement. Representatives from the New York Attorney General's office and the former Corcoran Gallery completed the board. On October 13, 2018, the foundation held an inaugural gala fundraiser. More than 500 people attended, paying ticket prices ranging from $1,500 for 2 guests to $50,000 for 20 guests in a private living room with butler service. The event was described as an elegant, Gatsby-esque soiree showcasing the estate's history and potential. It was the first time most attendees had been inside the gates. The house that had been closed for 65 years opened for one night to people who paid handsomely for the privilege. In January 2020, the foundation auctioned most of the doll collection, raising nearly $2 million while retaining select pieces for display. The French and Japanese dolls that Huguette had been collecting since age 5 were sold to collectors who would presumably appreciate them more than they could be appreciated sitting in cases in a mansion that had been empty for decades. In 2022, the Santa Barbara Historical Museum mounted an exhibition titled Huguette Marcel Clark, a portrait of the artist, featuring her paintings. The public saw for the first time that she had been a talented painter, that the 40 to 50 works she had created during summers at Bellosguardo demonstrated real skill with composition and color, that her artistic pursuits had been serious rather than merely the dabbling of a wealthy woman with too much time and money. In March 2022, Bill Dedman, who had co-authored the best-selling biography Empty Mansions about Huguette and her family, gave a sold-out lecture at the Historical Museum. The story was no longer a secret. The book had been published in 2013. The settlement had been public record, but the property itself remained closed, the physical manifestation of the story inaccessible, even as the story itself was told and retold. In May 2024, the foundation filed IRS Form 990, documenting the completion of its 5-year transition from private foundation to public charity. The tax status change allowed broader public support and donations. The bureaucratic milestone represented progress toward the foundation's mission of opening the property and fostering the arts. Finally, in 2023, public tours began. For the first time in Bellosguardo's 87-year history, counting from the completion of construction in 1936 or 37, visitors could walk through doors that had remained closed for 7 decades. The tours were limited to the ground floor because the elevator had not been fixed, and using the stairs without an alternative violated ADA accessibility requirements. The tours lasted 90 minutes. They were led by knowledgeable docents who could explain the history, architecture, and preservation. They cost $100 per person. Tickets were released periodically via email through bellosguardo.org and sold out quickly, sometimes within hours. Visitors saw the high-ceilinged foyer, the main hall with views of the reflecting pool, the reception room with its European paneling and painted muslin ceiling, the formal dining room, the music room with two Steinway grand pianos and Anna's French pedal harps and paintings by Cézanne and Renoir and Van Gogh. They saw the library with its bound volumes and the portrait of André over the fireplace. They saw the bureau room that had been Anna's office, with its intricate French-inspired carved pastoral scenes. They saw the studio gallery, with 50 of Huguette's paintings hanging exactly where she had left them. They saw Anna's bedroom with the harps and a Sargent painting. They walked through rooms that had been frozen in time for 7 decades, maintained at a cost of $28 million by a woman who could not bear to see them, but could not bear to let them decay. The foundation continued working toward expanded access. The City of Santa Barbara conditional use permit was still pending, required for second-floor tours, increased event capacity, and full grounds access. The elevator needed to be repaired. The infrastructure needed to be updated to handle larger crowds. The mission needed to be defined more precisely. What exactly did it mean to foster and promote the arts through a house that had been a private memorial? On a spring morning in 2023, a small group of visitors walked through the doors of Bellosguardo for the first time since Anna and Huguette Clark stopped coming 70 years before. They saw the music room where Huguette had played piano and violin. They saw the studio where she had painted 50 works that now hung on the walls. They saw the library where Anna had read beside her daughter. They saw the reflecting pool that had mirrored California skies since 1937. Everything was exactly as Huguette had ordered it kept, unchanged, preserved, perfect. The $40,000 per month she had spent for 58 years had accomplished exactly what she wanted. Bellosguardo survived. The mansion she had preserved by never visiting had become what she wished, a monument to her mother, a time capsule of their life together, and now, finally, a gift to a public that would see what she could not bear to visit. William Andrews Clark built his fortune on copper mines that eventually closed, railroads that were absorbed into larger systems, and a Senate seat remembered primarily for the bribes that purchased it. The 121-room Fifth Avenue mansion was demolished in 1928. The Butte mansion became a bed and breakfast. Las Vegas grew beyond recognition, his name surviving only in a county designation that few residents can explain. Everything he built with such ruthless determination either disappeared or transformed into something he would not recognize. What endured was the house he never intended to matter. Bellosguardo was purchased as a summer retreat 2 years before his death, a minor property in a vast portfolio, damaged by earthquake, and seemingly destined for the same fate as his other holdings. Instead, it became the monument that outlasted everything else, preserved not through his ambition, but through his daughter's grief, maintained not for display, but for memory, kept perfect because someone who loved deeply could not bear to see what had been lost. Anna built her palace during the Depression, creating something that was finally hers rather than William's, French rather than American, designed for privacy rather than spectacle. Huguette spent 58 years ensuring that nothing changed, that every room remained as her mother had left it, that the beautiful lookout would wait forever if necessary. The preservation cost approximately $28 million and required a degree of devotion that looked like madness to everyone, except possibly Huguette herself. Today, visitors pay $100 for 90-minute tours of the ground floor, walking through rooms that were closed for 7 decades. They see Huguette's paintings in the studio where she created them. They see Anna's harps in the music room where she played them. They see the library where mother and daughter read together, speaking French for privacy, living only for each other after André died. The house teaches what preservation costs and what loss creates. It shows that sometimes the most valuable thing is not the fortune or the ambition or the railroads or the Senate seat, but simply the decision to keep something unchanged when everything else is falling apart. If this story resonated with you, consider visiting Bellosguardo when tours become available, or exploring the other estates where grief and wealth created something worth preserving. Sometimes the most interesting legacies are the ones no one intended to leave behind.